So, thank you so much, everybody, for joining, and welcome this evening. We are here with Wise Wellness Guild members to learn more about trends that define the generations. So, as a part of our careers, we have learned that we will have between 4 and 5 generations at any one point in time working alongside each other. And as we think about things as influence and how we navigate the types of cultures that we want to be a part of, and how we really think about innovation and how each of those different generations can play a role in the work that we do. We started the conversation a couple of weeks ago on really the importance of just understanding the differences between those generations. Tonight, we have Lisa and Shannon who are going to be speaking to us more about how we really take those differences, understanding them, understanding and being aware of them, and identifying the differences to be able to unlock opportunity. So that way, as we move forward in our careers, we can really embrace not only what makes us the same in all of our values, but really looking towards how we leverage differences to evoke change, how we leverage to evoke innovation and evoke connection. So thank you so much, Lisa and Shannon, for joining. I know that you both have extensive background in working together. You've worked together previously as several members of our team have for Wise Wellness Guild. So you have an incredible bond, and it's absolutely beautiful to see between women. But I think that what really has struck me with your expertise in this space is how you both, coming from different generations, have really been able to dive deep into this and learn more through your experiences and working together on teams and being able to take that in your separate career. So I would love for you to introduce yourselves, share a little bit about your background, and then we'll just go ahead and dive in. The rules of the road are that if you have any questions, please put them into the chat. Feel free to come off of mute. We would love to see your beautiful faces if you're willing and open. And we will go ahead and post this to the member portal for anybody who was unavailable to attend. I know that I did receive a lot of feedback that people who were at Wise Women Wednesday really enjoyed the content, but several people couldn't join because of kids' sports and some school activities, so are eagerly kind of awaiting this recording. So thank you so much, Lisa and Shannon. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Stevie.
Thank you. Hi, Shannon. Okay, you want to go ahead and dive in?
Yeah.
Great.
You want me to introduce myself first, Lisa, or do you?
Absolutely. Shannon, go ahead.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Shannon Jenkins. I am a marketer, and I've worked with Lisa, as Stevie mentioned, in 2 previous jobs. In fact, she was maybe my second manager ever when I was a recent graduate working at Mead, Westvaco with school supplies. And she was the best manager that I'd ever had in my life. And so it's a catch-22 when you have your best manager as your first manager, because everything after that is pretty much a letdown. So about maybe a year and a half ago, Lisa accepted a job, and she asked me to be her director of marketing, and without a doubt, I took that role because it was her. And even though I think maybe 10 years had passed, Lisa, since then, she left such an incredible mark on my career and me as a person, and just supported me, that it was definitely a no-brainer. So it is just me on a personal level. I am married, have 2 young, very active boys. One is 4 and one is 3, and they are all boy. And that's all about me.
Thanks, Shannon. I don't know what to say. I'm so blushing. My name is Lisa Brooks, and I'm a consumer packaged goods marketing professional. I love the voice of the consumer, and of course, with consumer and shopper insights, that is really what ultimately I probably wake up in the morning for, trying to uncover a nugget or an aha that really can move the market or really shift the way brands and consumers integrate with them. To Shannon's detail, yes, so it was over 10 or 12 years ago. Shannon and I both worked at Mead Consumer and Office Products. We worked on the school business. So that is anytime you are buying a notebook or a trapper keeper or maybe even a backpack, we worked on that business together. And that's where we kind of started this love affair around generations. What we found was that the consumer and the shopper were two different generations. You know, you had in this case, a young millennial, because at that time millennials were in elementary, middle school, high school, and just graduating through college. So you had a millennial using the products, and yet their parent or grandparent were the purchasers, the shoppers. So we've uncovered that there was a little bit of a difference. Through some prompting, we encouraged the director of research to acquire some generational study information. It was a very expensive purchase for our company at the time. We used it on our product messaging, and it actually worked. And then internally, we used it both as we interacted with each other, as well as we used it on sales calls, because at that time, millennials were just graduating and entering their initial positions, first jobs, and Target being one of our top customers. Target's always known for bringing in new and young talent. And so we actually used that, because I was on a call in particular where we had a 25-year-old millennial who was a Target buyer and our senior vice president of sales who was an elder baby boomer. And there were some clear communication misses in the call. So we kind of took a step back and really kind of uncovered what are some of the key trends that really define generations. You know, we are a little different. And fundamentally, if we just kind of recognize that, you know, you can it can really help you understand where everyone's coming from. It's all about empathy. It's just like anything else when you're in the workplace. But I think sometimes we overlook generations. So with that, let's go over, so to succeed in today's business climate, you really do need to approach each other with informed generational perspective, recognizing the underlying biases, values, and expectations that pave the way to yes. With 5 distinct generations in today's modern workplace, but we're primarily going to focus on the top 4 right now, the tenet is increasingly difficult to fulfill. Never before have we had employees working on teams with others the age of their grandchildren. And never before have we had so many communication tools such as email, text, social media that further dismantle even our best communication efforts. We no longer see a face or hear a voice, and so that really is adding to some challenges. Different generations have different communication styles and preferences. For example, baby boomers will cancel meetings via a phone call, while millennials will cancel via text message. And Generation Z, they love Snapchat message. So here's a quick chart. When we talk about generations today, we're going to be focusing primarily on the major Western world generations. Generations do vary a little bit as you look at different countries and different parts of the globe. So we primarily are focusing on US generations as it's defined. You know, it's really important to think about the fact that in 2020, this year, basically 50% of the US workforce is US millennials. Roughly 36% is Gen Z. So you do see a big shift. You know, we talk about baby boomers, we talk about Gen X, millennials, and Gen Y in the workplace. I know I even personally have experienced that the generation before baby boomers, the silent generation, they are also still in that workplace. Like I mentioned just recently, I worked in a company where there were 3 silent generation members working in that workplace. So, but we're going to focus primarily on these top 4. So basically it comes down to, do you remember a world before ISIS? Do you remember your first Facebook post? Or maybe you remember your first SMS? Or maybe you remember how old you were when you heard that JFK had been shot and killed. These questions prove ways in understanding the great communication, to understand and respect differently to each generation, leadership styles, and technology. Great communication shifts to meet the needs of each generation. So we're going to go ahead and review the new rules of engagement, starting with understanding the generations. So first we walk into baby boomers. So baby boomers, who's a boomer? Boomers are the children of the greatest generation. Born between the years 1946 and 1964, boomers believe that you can have it all if you work hard enough. Their attitude about life is mostly optimistic, as long as you take on the responsibility to make good things happen. The belief, work hard and reap the reward, results in a purposeful and participatory attitude towards authority. They are the rock and roll, Elvis, Beatles, Woodstock, miniskirts, Barbie generation, the first TV generation, the first tolerant generation, the first generation to influence via their size and their power. Okay, boomer, here's a little bit about you. So when we talk about all the generations, we're going to be talking about a few key trends. Typically, the generations are molded by parenting, tech, and one other thing. So baby boomers were molded by parenting, teen culture, and also outsized power. So first, parenting. Baby boomers grew up in circumstances that previous generations could never have imagined. Raised during a period of economic prosperity and optimistic times within a nuclear family when children were a focus. They played in spacious backyards of detached suburban homes with mortgages subsidized by the GI Bill. They completed secondary education and entered college in greater numbers than ever before. They spent summer vacations riding in a family station wagon over newly completed interstate highways. They were the first kids to grow up watching TV. In short, they were heirs to something brand new. They were heirs to a modern middle class with the means and freedom to achieve unprecedented self-determination. You have to realize that the generation before, oftentimes when you were a tween or a teen, your family would send you off to work in a factory or on the farm. Baby boomers were really the first generation to be afforded that lifestyle where they could actually sit and watch TV as a teen or a tween. This was something very new. And this leads into our second trend, which is teen culture. In 1963, Pepsi-Cola kicked off a TV, radio, print, and billboard campaign. Of course, as a marketer, I get kind of really geeked out about this. It made advertising history. Pepsi showed young people motorcycling, skiing, surfboarding, and flirting. The product itself was barely described as the choice of livelier, active people. With the young view of things, the campaign's tagline, "Come alive, you're the Pepsi generation." This campaign didn't just speak to a generation, it truly defined this generation, the baby boomers. It was a rebuff of the past and shared project of youthful freedom and fun. The Encyclopedia of Major Marketing Campaigns puts it this way: in a stunning reversal of conventional advertising, Pepsi made the consumer, not the product, the hero of its ads, and in its process sold viewers on a portrait of themselves. And this really speaks to, again, really how baby boomers view themselves. During this time, the average teen boy's weekly allowance went from $2.41 in 1946 up to $8.96 in 1956, just 10 years later, which drove early purchasing power. The generation has held on to that power, and it's estimated that 80% of the domestic financial power is still in the boomers' hands today. Although with baby boomers' attitude of "I want it all and I want it all right now," little is expected to pass into the hands of their children through inheritance. The third and final thing that defines baby boomers is their outsized power. The baby boom was described as a shock wave. Baby boomers drove economic and social changes. According to the study, societal impacts have played a great role in shaping the characteristics of baby boomers, which in turn have reshaped society. They are the builders of the world we live in today. Baby boomers think differently. Due to their large numbers, their thoughts and their beliefs dominated almost everything in society. Baby boomers were impacted by the ways in which society changed after the post-war years. Ideas about gender, family, and sexuality underwent a great change. Concepts such as parenting, aging, retirement, labor, and so forth were completely redefined by them. Baby boomers peaked at a population of 78.8 million and remained the largest living adult group until 2015, when millennials outnumbered the baby boomers. By mid-century, the baby boomer population is projected to dwindle down to 16.6 million. So who are the baby boomers? The boomers are builders, and they are still tinkering. Their driver is legacy creation. Boomers are the architects of today's structure. They built the corporations, bureaucracy, our volunteer structures, and they have absolutely no plan to slow down. Remember, they love working. They have been working their entire lives, and they do not have any intention of quitting. Baby boomers value relationships, as they did not grow up with technology running their lives. Baby boomers grow up making phone calls and writing letters, solidifying strong interpersonal skills. Yet, as they got older, they actually became fluent in technology and now use cell phones and tablets. The difference is how they use these technologies. They use them as productivity tools as opposed to connectivity tools, an idea that came from the millennial generation. When speaking with a boomer, acknowledge their legacy because it's the world that they created for us. Boomers are conversational clever. They are auditory learners. They learn through listening. And this makes sense because as they were coming to age, language ruled. There was a strong emphasis on Latin, debate, and the humanities when they were in school. To communicate to a boomer, verbal communication is the best. Try it in person or on the phone. Use auditory sentence patterning. You can use it as an example. So I hear what you're saying, or what I am hearing is. Allow them to talk things out. Boomers enjoy talking. Talking is a boomer soother. Their eyes will roll to the right when they remember and will roll to the left when they are considering a solution. That is the baby boomer. Quick recap on the baby boomer. Before we go into Gen X, does anyone have any questions about baby boomers? Now, of course, baby boomers being such a large population, you do sometimes see some subsegments, but for this purpose, to kind of keep it simple, I kept it as just one large group.
No, this is such a wealth of incredible knowledge. And as I think about the so what on this, I think that as we go through each pieces, I just wanted to quick gut check share what's going in my brain. So obviously we're two marketers. Well, we're all of us, I think almost everybody on this call is in some way a communicator, right? So we'll go with that. Yes. But for me in particular, how I take this is I really do think that for me, understanding more about, how is you think about what brings people joy, right? And you think about hearkening back to the way that people grew up and understanding that at a values level, a lot of what you said about boomers actually resonated with me. And so I think that it's always important for us to think about things that connect us and things that we find as being an opportunity for us to like drive connection. So when you're in that really difficult conversation over the Thanksgiving table about the things that are different, maybe there's some things that you can find that are, that you can connect with people on. I think that the other thing is on communication style. What I find is, and I know that you'll get into a little bit of this, but the last week as we were talking about different generations that might be thriving more than others in this current circumstance, I think that in-person or phone is really fascinating from a boomer standpoint, because as I've spoken personally to a lot of boomers, they're really struggling with not having the in-person. They, in fact, if you remember, you had all of millennials like myself yelling at our parents saying, no, like you can't go do XYZ in person, like don't do. And so it's really interesting to kind of know like that's intrinsically kind of how they like to engage and interact. So I
agree, Stevie. Yes. And I know I've taken this information. I use this information quite most frequently. I reported to a boomer, and knowing how much they really want that verbal communication and more importantly in person, it really did help me really navigate working with them. I think historically I wasn't even completely aware. Um, but and also the biggest thing is honoring their legacy. They really, they've done such great work in this country and they have built what this country is. And, I think it's all too easy for us to be critical of what's happening in this country. But the truth is that when we criticize that, then we're criticizing what they've done and what they've given us.
Absolutely. Yeah,
So
no,
that's always a really critical point to remember as well.
no, I love that. And I put this into the chat, but like these visual like slides are just like something of my dreams.
That's
Like
the marketing piece of you.
I'm feeling very like aesthetically calm right now. I'm very thank you for this.
And you're on brand also.
I know. I'm so grateful for you because as we're getting into this, I think that I think that you are such a great marketer because each one actually I think also speaks to the generation itself. Like I acknowledge your holding shape for the X reminds me of MTV, which is how it really harkens back. So and I see it in there. So you're just really great. So thank you so much. Keep going. I just wanted to like as we're kind of going through each one of these, just how we can wrap our head around the so what and what like tangible next steps we can take, I think is really great.
So moving on to Gen X. So Gen X is also known as the latchkey generation, the MTV generation. Stevie mentioned it last week, the sandwich generation. So, and I will just put in full disclosure, this is my generation. So no one cares about Generation X. Squeezed between baby boomers and millennials, those born between the years of 1965 and 1979 are an unsung generation. Time magazine once even sneered, hardly recognized as a social force or even noticed much at all. While the baby boomers had a placid childhood in the 1950s, which helped inspire them start their own revolution, Gen X grew up during a time of drugs, divorce, and economic strains. They virtually reared themselves. TV provided the surrogate parenting, and Ronald Reagan starred as the real-life Mr. Rogers, dispensing reassurance during their troubled adolescence. Generation X witnessed a series of crises in their youth: Watergate, racial strife, homelessness, AIDS, and the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Challenger explosion, which, by the way, I watched the show on. They had a 25-year recap on that this weekend. That's what I watched this weekend. Fractured families and federal deficits. Heroes and leaders were nowhere in sight. Tough-skinned, latchkey kids craved security but rarely found it either at home or as they grew up in a more globalized, less forgiving workplace. Society and thus individuals are envisioned as disposable to Gen X. Gen Xers are also called the MTV generation. They experienced the emergence of music videos, new wave music, electronic, glam rock, heavy metal, punk, grunge, and hip hop. It's the Nirvana, YouTube, Madonna, Torn Jeans, Friends, Beverly Hills 90210, and PC generation. So again, looking at the generation molded by parenting, tech, and distrust. But in this case, Gen X was actually molded by lack of parenting. Gen Xers were raised at a time when society was actually less focused on children and more focused on adults. It was the first generation of widespread divorce and broken homes. It was also the first generation of dual income households, and it's estimated that almost 50% of Gen Xers went from school home to an empty house. I know I was one of them. The first to grow up with a large adult presence with both parents worked led to Gen Xers being far more peer-oriented than previous generations. For Gen X, friends were important. Thus, the onset of that's when Friendsgiving all started. Gen X also was inspired by technology. You might be surprised, right? But as computing and the internet became widely accessible, this group grew up with rapid advancement of technology. From Atari games to computer DOS programming in middle school to their first personal computer. Mine was actually the iMac G3 in this beautiful teal color, pictured right here on the screen. And you'll completely fully understand why that was so special to me until we get to the next slide, and I'll talk about it. Gen X are digital immigrants. It was Gen X where the video game craze started. Today, there are actually 162 million game console owners. Gen X was the first to bare their souls in 1984. The founding father of blogging actually started. Gen X was the first to socialize online via online bulletin boards and email discussion groups. And later, Gen Xers founded some of our first social media platforms, including Friendster in 2002, MySpace in 2003, and Twitter in 2006. By the way, the final thing that Gen X was really molded by is distrust. And I have pictures from the 70s, and all my childhood pictures look like this. There are these like brown, gritty pictures. I have no idea. 70s were just not pretty years. But anyway, Generation X was exposed to early challenges in the home: divorce, unemployment, energy crisis, disappointed by big institutions from government to organized religion to marketing and advertising. Gen X had its idealistic self-depreciation phase. Nevermind was Nirvana's biggest album. We're Not Worthy, said Wayne and Garth, and over time, people believed them. And as a result, too many Americans don't know who they are, and this generation continues to be as mysterious as the X moniker. Even many Gen Xers don't identify with their generation cohort. Only 43% call them Gen X, call themselves Gen X. So moving on to the next slide. So Generation X they're visual learners, which is exactly why that teal iMac was so beautiful to me. Generation X are doers. Their drivers are money, work, and the fear of losing it. They are independent and they have a very entrepreneurial spirit. Gen X was reared by TV, Sesame Street, electric company, Saturday morning cartoons, TV dinners, TV trays, TV cable. Hence, Generation X are visual learners. They learn through seeing things. Where boomers love language, we love pictures. Gen X learns by pictures, graphs, charts, magazine, maps, diagrams. You may have even remembered the VMAs a couple of years ago. Pink was talking and she put together a PowerPoint for her daughter. And now you might be seeing where some of that stress might be happening in the workplace. You have baby boomers that are auditory and Gen X is visual. To communicate to a Gen X, visual communications are best. Use email or text. Gen X is engaged when they have a notebook. They also love their whiteboard or a PowerPoint. PowerPoints are their soothers. See, Stevie, this is all coming full circle, isn't it? Use visual sentence patterns when you're talking to a Gen X. Say, I'm not clear on what you're saying. Can you give me a picture? When Gen X is thinking or remembering, their eyes go up to the right. And yet when they're creating a solution, their eyes go to the left. Gen X is adept at providing information and direction and do not understand when people cannot think or act on their own. Millennials frustrate Gen X. We'll move on to Millennials, but before we do, does anyone have any questions on my generation?
I just more had a question in regards to more of a philosophy. It's more of a philosophy question. If you scroll right back up, I get a lot of questions from Gen X around. So I want to talk about environment style for a second. A lot of the Gen Xers that I know are not flexible. So talk to me more about environment style, because I think that that's the more, maybe it's more of the personality types, I would say, maybe that I'm around, but it's the kind of like want like a lot of rigor more around like how they structure their day. I think because of like that latchkey concept in a way.
Well, I was going to say, and we might have just an interpretation here. So because of the latchkey generation, this Gen X is actually the one, this is the generation that's actually driving flexibility, work from home, more life work flexibility. I think a lot of people think millennials have been driving that, but the truth is that Gen X has been driving that because they were the ones that witnessed, like, their parents couldn't go to their sports activity because their parents were working, and they were really the generation that first felt that pain.
Yes.
So as this generation, as Generation X, it's estimated that about 55% of leadership roles in the US economy right now are filled by Gen Xers. That's one of the biggest things. I think that's one of the most positive things that Gen X is bringing to the workplace today, is they're bringing that flexibility. They really do want their team members and fellow employees to have that life-work balance. That life-work balance is really important to them. Baby boomers, they love to work. Life-work balance isn't important. To Gen X, it is important. And I think in the subsequent generations, millennials and Gen Z, it is important. So that's where there's a really big kind of rift even between that oldest generation, some of those younger ones. So I think, Stevie, your question might be a little bit more on just the semantics of what we're saying as an environmental style.
No, I think that that's so good, because I think that, again, like you said, I mean, that's why the Gen X is thriving right now in like a work environment from home, right? And like how being able to have that flexibility, because they also do have like that. I was just on a call earlier today. That travel time for them is just a sunk block of time that just drains them, because they're like, what could I be doing to be productive during this time, because I have so many things going on. I guess so maybe a different way of saying it is like, it sounds like if they're the ones driving the flexibility, what will be fascinating is how millennials have adapted to that flexibility within the environment, and if that's something that they are able to accommodate. So I'm very interested to see how these two play together, I guess.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, awesome.
I agree. Yeah. So we'll move on to Gen Y, otherwise known as millennials, echo boomers, and Generation Me. So baby boomers are the parents of millennials. Boomers were raised in optimistic times when there was a strong focus on children, yet they were still level set. They were always being told, you don't think you're special, do you? So boomers wanted to really raise their children different. They made sure their children felt special, unique, catered to. Boomers wanted to make the world easier for their children. Baby boomers always accomplished what they set out to do, and raising their children was no exception. This resulted in one of the number one traits of the millennial generation, which is entitlement. Referenced as echo boomers, the me generation, or the trophy generation, millennials were born between the years of 1980 and 1995. Known as sophisticated, technologic-wise, and immune to most traditional marketing and sales pitches, they've seen it all and been exposed to it all since early childhood. Many reference millennials as having Peter Pan generation because their perceived tendency to delay some steps into adulthood, like housing, career, and marriages, for longer periods of time than most other generations before them. These labels were also a reference to a trend towards members living with their parents for longer. In 2019, 35% of this generation still lived with their parents, and we just talked about this last week, that with the COVID, it's actually pushed another 15% of the younger portion of the millennial generation back home with their parents. As of late, millennials are being defined not by age, but actually by two different life paths. So in this case, I will talk about millennials being broken up by two groups, because they really are. There's two very different groups. There are what's being called the millennials, where they feel their lives have been stagnated as they struggle with student loan debt and the fallout of the recession, and now, of course, COVID. And then the other group are the mega-lennials, and they're moving forward financially and professionally and don't identify with really the negative stereotypes that are associated with that millennial generation. Millennials are the Yahoo, mobile phones, Google, Facebook, iPhone generation. With unlimited access to information, they tend to be assertive with strong views. They vision the world as a 24/7 place, want fast and immediate processing. Generation Y is less brand loyal, and the speed of the internet made them flexible and changing in their fashion, style, consciousness, and where and how it is communicated. So millennials were molded by parenting, tech, and power inversion. So I love this. So first of all, the baby on board sign. So as a Gen X, I was thrown into the back of a station wagon. There were easily 8 to 10 kids and not a single safety belt in sight. Versus in 1986, the baby on board sign was born. All of a sudden, this signaled something completely different. Don't run into me. I have a loved child on board. And this really is really where it became different. You know, millennials were baby boomers were different parents to millennials. You know, there's a big shift in how attitudes changed, and it changed even that relationship. 55% of millennials cite that one of their parents is their best friend. Um, this would never have happened in previous generations. Neither a Gen X or a baby boomer would have ever said that their parent was their best friend. And it was really different because the baby boomers leaned heavily to millennials to make major decisions in the house. Where are we going to go on vacation? What kind of car do you want? We need a new car. What car do you like? We need a new home. What home do you like? Millennials were involved in those home decisions. They were treated really as an equal in the household, and that's fantastic. The other thing is technology, and primarily access to technology is what really shapes millennials today. As far back as they can remember, millennials have had access to the world's information curated in a blank search box in the palm of their hand. Millennials were the very first generation to feel the impact of access. Access caused millennials to have different perspectives, expectations, and behaviors. Access changed how millennials search, learn, socialize, travel, communicate, build businesses, network, entertain themselves, sell, buy, and work. Because the environment was different, the generation became different. The environment was the most high-tech, complex, and innovative in human history. This hyper-connected and fully accessible environment is now every generation's reality, but it was really very fresh for millennials. And then finally, power inversion. And this one's really fascinating to me. You know, millennials really shifted, you know, baby boomers used their outsized power to really drive change. But when you emerge outside power with technology, you get something that's different, and that's a power inversion. Brands and companies once told consumers how to think and what to buy. But the sheer size of this millennial group, coupled with transparency via the internet and social networks, millennials have thrusted that power to be the opposite. Single Facebook or Twitter posts have prompted the removal of products from the market or companies struggling to regain relevancy. The power is in the hand of the consumer, and true power is the ability to influence others. And in fact, 8 out of 10 millennials believe it's their responsibility or even their civic duty to share feedback with others. 78% lean into their peers before they even purchase anything. So it's this power inversion, this shift in power that really makes you millennials. Generation Y or millennials are kinesthetic learners. So millennials are adapters. They adopt and improve things. They are having a difficult time living in a boomer-centric world. Millennials' driver is development. Millennials' whole entire lives have been developmental activities and imposed structure. Millennials were loved and coddled, the first generation with play dates instead of playtime. While competition ruled in schools for Gen X, it shifted towards self-esteem for Generation Y. Millennials grew up with schedules on fridges that organize their worlds. Millennials do very well with detail and structure, but in a different environment. Millennials are kinesthetic learners. They learn by activities or action, carrying out physical activities rather than listening to a lecture or watching demonstrations. After all, millennials grew up with the internet at their fingertips, and they've learned everything through just a single action, Google search. To communicate to a millennial, use SMS or social platforms. Allow them to think in terms of action. Find a way to be active. When working with a millennial, ask their opinion. After all, their parents always valued their opinion as equals. Give them structure and detail, the proverbial chart on the fridge, to help drive that solution. Millennials also process kinesthetically when processing thoughts. Their heads will go down and to the right when they're remembering, and their head goes down to the left when they are creating a solution. And as a side note, millennials have an attention span of 12 seconds. So Shannon, millennial, you want to chime in?
Yeah. I don't know. What are the two you mentioned? The millennial and the.
Yeah, hold on. The millennial and the mega.
Yeah, I was gonna say mega, but I didn't want to be wrong. I don't know which one I am. I think that's even a more micro lens of it. But yeah, this is definitely on point with millennials. But I do like, because I am on that cusp, I kind of do. I said this last time, but I associate with some of the other ones too, just because of, where I am. I feel like millennials and boomers would have more in common than a millennial and a wire. I don't know why I get that. Just maybe because of that upbringing, that parental kind of upbringing, um, and the values and everything like that. But that's just some of the similarities that I feel.
Yeah,
Just
there are a lot of commonalities between baby boomers and millennials. One is Generation Me, and the other one is the Me generation. There are commonalities because they were in the home together. But there's just that little bit of a shift in parenting style, and then of course technology comes in, and that creates just that difference. So when you're in a workplace, those two generations, you act differently and have different expectations of roles and motivations.
Yeah. And it's funny you mentioned that, because there's a couple memes out there that to someone else, like maybe an exer, they don't think is as hilarious as I do. But because like in some of the jobs that I've had, I've literally become best friends with like a 60-year-old. I don't know why. I'm like, and then like, your best friend at work is 60 and they don't come to work, and you're like, oh man, Miss Rita's not here today, so it's kind of funny that way.
Yeah. I think I agree with Shannon on that I feel like I have some other characteristics from some of the other generations. And I don't know if it's just because of growing up, like you said, in the household around those aunties, uncles who, grew up in those different generations, and they expected, I guess, something different. So they kind of taught you some of the things that they knew growing up, like by working hard, set certain expectations with you. So you just kind of like adopt those in a way. And so it almost kind of like carries over, because I find myself to be like a super hard worker, probably overwork too much. And it's so funny because like I have so many characteristics of like a millennial, but then sometimes I'm like, I'm not a millennial. I don't want to be in that category, almost like perceived as like in a negative way. So it was just interesting to kind of hear these perspectives. But I think it would also be good too to hear about how to use some of these generational differences inside of the workplace, because I have found myself struggling. And I've had different bosses from like different, age ranges, but struggling like to communicate with different people lately, now that I've noticed. And I'm not for sure of what it is, if it's like a communication style, but for some reason, I don't know if it's just COVID. I mean, it could be all the things, right? But just trying to figure out, like, is there a better way to communicate and talk with the different generations, even during this very difficult time?
Yeah, I think COVID's definitely adding a little bit of a ratchet into just really generally how we all communicate. But to your point, like these generations, it's just like anything else, you need to, it's not always completely set. Just because you're born between certain years, it doesn't mean that this completely identifies with who you are. Especially if you're even on some of the fringe years, or even you could be smack dab in the middle of this single generation and maybe you're just different. You should never, I mean, it's just like anything else. These are just kind of some loose guidelines to take in consideration. You can kind of try it if you're working with a baby boomer and, interpret and use some of the communication styles as a loose guideline. If it's not working, then maybe he or she doesn't apply to that generational suggestion. But this is just like one generation is just one other factor. I feel like we constantly are navigating some of the other differences in the workplace, but I think oftentimes we don't think of generational differences as a big consideration when working with.
One thing that I will say, Lisa, that, you know, that comes to mind is when you talked about boomers, is just like hearing them out and basically just like respecting them. And I think that can go a long way. You know, sometimes, you know, as a millennial or even, you know, as Shannon, I might, you know, want to get to the point and not entertain the 30-minute conversation. But I think that might be an opportunity there, at least for me, that I see, is just to hear them out and just listen and understand that maybe by listening to them, I'm not to get, there's no solution at the end, but it's literally just to be an ear for them.
And I think also another consideration is just life stage, right? You know, there's who you are because of a generation, but there's also who you are because of a life stage. So we spoke a little bit last week that even though COVID is impacting generation baby boomer, or even the silent generation or greatest generation, I actually still have some grandmothers that are living that are part of the greatest generation. And even though it's impacting them from a health perspective, they are not being impacted as heavily on an emotional or psychological perspective. And that is primarily, and Loris tagged it exactly, it's because they have been through so many experiences that they're able to sort of level set a little bit more effectively than the younger generations, primarily Gen Z or Gen X, or sorry, Gen Z or Gen Y. So that's the other thing to consider is, you know, baby boomers may also um, love to talk through things because they have all these experiences from which we can learn from, and they want to share and help us. So I think when you kind of look at the generation and what period they may fall in as a loose gauge, but also always represent or respect, um, you know, where people are in their life cycle as well. I mean, in Gen Z, they're in college. Some of them haven't entered college yet. Some are just graduating and entering the workforce. You know, and so where they are, like think where you were when you were, you know, 21, 22, 23, 24, and coming through. That also kind of adds another layer. And really, all of this is just about empathy and really trying to kind of put yourself into someone else's place, understand where they're coming from, so that you can achieve what you're trying to accomplish in the workplace and also in personal relationships. So with that, we'll move on to our final generation, which is Gen Z. Gen Z is also known as the iGen. They're also known as technoholics and also homeland generation. So while no one cared about Gen X, it's noted today that those skeptical slackers have created something that so many people are viewing as the key to their success, and that's Generation Z. It's the generation born after 1995, and they have never known a world without computers or cell phones. They are digital integrators, having integrated technology seamlessly into their lives and having used it from the very earliest age. It's almost like that air that they breathe, permeating almost all the areas of their lifestyle and their relationship. They are savvy consumers, and they know what they want and how to get it, and and they are oversaturated with brands. Although they have grown up in a global world with global focus and global problems, economic downturns, global warming, ISIS, and school shootings. And now, you know, obviously COVID will certainly probably be added to one of those benchmarks as really impacting this generation. Globally focused, visually engaged, educationally transformed, socially defined, it is the generation that will experiment Google Glass, nano computing, 3D printing, and driverless cars. I mean, think about what their lives are really going to look like. It's just so fascinating. They are referred as technoholics because they are entirely dependent on technology. So Gen Z is really primarily molded by parenting again, tech, and truth. Gen Z was the first generation to grow up in technology. They are also the first generation to grow up with global terrorism and school murders. They travel in packs and never leave their phone behind. When they are stressed, They reach for their phone. Why? As a child, they were given a phone, iPad, or tablet to be calmed. Technology is their soother. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped a page. All right. Gen Z was molded by parenting, tech, and truth. So Gen Z is raising Gen X is raising Gen Z to look like them, autonomous, cynical, but much looser reins. Gen Z shares the same levels of pessimism that their children had at the same year. Technology. So this is again, so the average Gen Zer received their first mobile phone at the age of 10 years. Most of them grew up playing with their parents' mobile phone. They have grown up in a very hyper-connected world, and the smartphone is their preferred method of communication. And finally, truth. This is really fascinating. I think we see this right now happening, especially in the world today. So for Generation Z, the search for truth is at the base of their behavior. So first of all, they've had this transparency, i.e. a smartphone in their hand. And so anytime they want to look for something or uncover what is really the truth, it's right there. But their desire to express individual truth through the uniqueness of who they are, they desire to connect with others through shared truth. And they have an understanding of each other's differences through the truth. And they live a pragmatic life by accepting the truth of all things. Truth is really important. If you sit down with a Gen Zer, they will talk about really what is the cornerstone of truth. They want to know what's behind things, and they will search for it. They are not one who believes in brands messaging. It's a kind of a further extension of that power inversion shift that we saw with millennials. It's one step deeper, but it's very personal for Gen Z. So with Gen Z, they are technology learners. So they were the first generation to grow up in technology. They are also the first generation to grow up with global terrorism and school murders. Technology is their soother. Keep in mind, if when they were young, if their parents were going off and leaving them with a babysitter, they were given a tablet or a smartphone to calm. So really, they do lean into technology as their soother. To communicate to a Gen Zer, use FaceTime or another video chat. Messages, phone calls, that's really boring. Gen Z, it's all about hanging out on video, and 72% of Gen Z wants this in the work environment. I wonder how that's working for them with Zoom calls during COVID. And this is also an interesting note. Gen Z has the attention span of 8 seconds. If you remember, millennials were at 12 as an average, so we've lost a few seconds. But before you judge, you need to realize that they process information so fast. They are the most savvy multitaskers that we as a generation have ever seen. Another side note on Gen Z that I find particularly interesting is that there are many, 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 many articles. And I think with COVID, I think this is even going to become even more strong. But sometimes we reference the greatest generation, which is the generation that went off to World War II, came back, rebuilt an economy, obviously gave us the baby boomers, and they are always referenced as this generation that just was so strong and persevered and gave us so much. Gen Z right now is kind of framing up as being the next greatest generation. So I know I particularly am really interested in seeing this group grow. Obviously, they're still very young in their age, with just the oldest Gen Zs entering the workplace as we speak. But it'll be interesting to know how Gen Zers evolve and grow, because they are, a lot of people are very fascinated as they study the generations. People are especially fascinated with this generation. So we have one final slide where we kind of talk about, we have a quick recap slide of all the generations, this is kind of a quick referenceable. And the big thing here is, I'm different and you're different. We are all very different. We communicate differently. We use technology in different ways, and we solve problems differently. So as you're in a workplace, or even with your own personal relationships, keep this as one other point of consideration as you're working with people communicating with people as a point of empathy, to really understand where someone else is coming
I have a question in regards to Gen Z. I think mostly when it comes to, you talk about chain of command. So if I were a Gen Zer in a corporate environment, if you will, like I know that for me, setting up a flat organization for wise is something that I'm interested in. I'm an elder millennial, and I like autonomy, and I like really thinking through, what I could, what that could do to kind of unlock, getting rid of hierarchy. But I wanted to just talk a little bit about maybe what hierarchy, what that, what the chain of a command looks like specifically for Gen Z, so I know how to better be a boss to Gen Zers, because we have a few on the team.
Gen Z is very entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
So it's really, they want looser reins than millennials.
Okay.
So it's a matter of setting up expectations.
Yep.
And clearly communicating the goal and the expectations,
Awesome.
and somewhat letting them discover and find their own path.
Awesome.
But I think just as a secondary add, I'll just add, earlier I brought up life cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Just as a secondary add, you also have to consider where people are in their life stage.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that once upon a time, a baby boomer mentioned this to me, and it's something that I consider all the time when I'm managing my teams, regardless of the generation, which is, he had mentioned to me, and he was a very successful P&Ger, spent his entire career nearly at P&G, obviously building great brands. And he said that it was really difficult for him sometimes because as he had team members work on a project, he would want to give them restraints because he wanted to ensure the success very quickly, ensure that success path very quickly. And there was a point in his career when he realized that everyone must go through their own path for them to grow and develop. And he said, really, the balance is, as a manager, to allow especially younger generations to, because he's like, you learn through your own experience, you learn through your own path. So as a manager, it's creating a pathway for them to learn and develop and explore, but also some guidelines so that you can get to that place as quickly as possible. Because especially Gen Z, like you mentioned, Stevie, if you're giving them too many guidelines, they will be unhappy. Yes. Because they really are, they want to think very differently, and they kind of really want to drive some of their own conclusions.
What is your thought on, and if you, Shannon, do you mind going down to the overall, the recap? Because I think that this is fascinating in terms of feedback. So again, millennials are very much about all we've heard is feedback is a gift. We continue to hear that, and it's the way that I think that Gen Xers and boomers have delivered it to us to say, look, just because you didn't do this perfect doesn't mean you're gonna disintegrate or catch on fire. It's okay if you're not perfect, right? Because but I think that on the converse, I feel that Gen Z, I find that a lot of times the propensity to give and receive feedback is there's some sort of there's a silo, there's almost they want without autonomy to kind of work in a silo and want to go and I don't know that there's necessarily the same level of collaboration, and therefore with the lack of collaboration kind of comes lack of feedback cycle. Do you have any more insight into that specifically?
Well, I think definitely that goes back to the millennials. If you think about it, as they were raised, they were raised in a collaborative home where parents, what generation would consider a child's impact on a potential car they would be purchasing or a home they would be purchasing. So millennials were, treated very differently. Gen Z being the children of Gen X, you have to realize I don't think that there was that type of collaboration, but also at the same time, technology was at the forefront. So they were kind of, I've never seen information about as to with Gen Z if it's created a, I don't want to say less extroverts, but I don't know if it's almost how I think how you're solving for problems. So millennials, if they're in the home and they're deciding what car they're going to purchase with their parents, that's collaborative and it's all involved. And whereas Gen Z, they were, while their parents were probably deciding what car they were purchasing, Gen Z was over on the couch playing a game because that's the tool, the tablet they had. So I think there's a little bit of a shift and a difference there between just those two very close generations. And Gen Z and Gen Y are referenced as being very quite similar to each other. Gen Z is kind of an extension of millennials, but yet there's still some differences because they do have a little bit more individual thought. They do want to kind of drive their own personal beliefs. Like I even mentioned with millennials, you had this power inversion, and then it went one step further to this search for truth. I think Gen Z is a little more just like they just kind of want to get down to the nitty gritty a little bit more than what millennials.
There's so many things with this that I would love to overlay. I said this the last time of like overlaying motivators and behaviors, looking at communication styles. So like Enneagram disc and like doing the double click on these. I think it's incredible. But then you overlay too, like you said, even getting a little bit more like woo woo about it. Like, are you a heart first or are you a head first, or like body first kind of person. And I definitely know a lot of the Gen Xers that I know are very like head first rational. And again, that might just be the people that I'm surrounding myself with. So this is not a broad stroke, but and I could imagine that with that comes a very specific type of communication style. Whereas some other millennials that I know, like I said, I'm on a cusp like Shannon. Like I sometimes sway to the Gen X and like, but from a millennial, I can imagine it's very like heart first, and therefore communication style is a little bit more enveloped and like inclusive.
And I think some of that, I as a Gen X, I was raised in a very pragmatic time, and that really shapes kind of sometimes, as optimistic and positive and empowering and emotional and connective that I am, I'm still a really kind of a pragmatist at the heart. If you think about the times, baby boomers were raised in very optimistic times, millennials. The early 80s, especially if you're an elder millennial, the early 80s were great times for our economy. And so, you were raised in very optimistic times. And of course, there's always going to be situational places that play, but there's, then Gen Z, I can't imagine what it's like going into school and I don't know if there's going to be an event at the school that day. So it'll be fascinating. I think, Gen Z is still a little, we kind of know what some major factors were that potentially will motivate how they are and how they're acting. But it's still very early as we look at Gen Z to truly understand who they will become. And because a lot of that too is still, it's life cycle, and obviously COVID. All of this was really, all of this is really based on information pre-COVID. And as we know, we're all living it right now. And as I always say, my empathy has just grown exponentially through these times because everyone's being impacted by COVID, some of the same ways and some of the different ways. It'd be very fascinating to see, a year, 2 years, 5 years from now, how COVID may have shifted some of these behaviors as well.
No, I think this is fantastic. And I would I think as the next step for me is I want to digest and process all of this, but I think that layering in that emotional intelligence of like, okay, so taking this information, there could be a really great opportunity for us to do some sort of a panel discussion, I think, with different representatives from different generations, and let's have a dialogue and discussion about what emotional intelligence looks like and how we can leverage understanding these differences and how we can maybe say, what would an actual, so when we say, you know, talk to me, like we're going to sit down and like, I need something from you, or let's use an example of like, I'm new to an organization. My boss is a baby boomer. I'm, you know, have a dotted line to a Gen X person, and I have a Gen Z direct report. Like, how does all of that kind of work together? And how do we think about that? Or I'm a millennial and have a baby boomer as a direct report. And like, how does that shift the dynamic? And, you know, that type of stuff I think would be really amazing to kind of scenario and play, only because you hear so much about these tensions happening in the workplace, so many negatives. But I think, like Shannon said, I mean, you walk in, and I know I very much connect with boomers on a very deep level. I like really love my interactions with them, but it's not dissimilar to what you said. I mean, 55% of millennials call their parents their best friends. So I think there's obviously something really deep there.
I think there's something really deep. Even just as a Gen X, I worked with a fellow Gen Xer, and somehow we had a discussion, a side discussion. It wasn't related to business. And she had shared the fact that, you know, her parents were divorced growing up. She was 6. She had a younger sister who was 5. Her parents were divorced. She lived with her mother. And it was actually her responsibility at the age of 6 of making sure, she lived in Manhattan at the time, and she had to walk her sister down a couple blocks to drop her off at kindergarten. And then she then walked another block or two to first grade at a different school. And, you know, so I think even if you kind of know some of these triggers or some of these life events, you know, you might be able to uncover them in some personal shares. And I mean, just even as being a Gen X, I really related to her as a Gen X. I mean, I would go home to an empty house, but that, you know, walking blocks by yourself with your younger sibling in Manhattan, downtown Manhattan, I couldn't even imagine.
Right.
And it really did echo kind of her style. And I really, because then I would even just even working with same generation, I understand a little bit more her style and really her actions and how she approached business, because there were many days where I felt like I was being walked to the school downtown Manhattan a couple blocks. So I find it incredibly fascinating. I do just want to say, it never always, when I was working at Mead and we first purchased all this information, it was tens of thousands of dollars information. It came in binders and binders. I couldn't get enough of it. But one Thanksgiving, I actually asked the director of research if I could take it home for my Thanksgiving, my family Thanksgiving. And I went through it and I read it. And, you know, there are moments where my aunts, my uncles, my parents, my grandparents, nieces and nephews, they thought it was really relatable to them. And there were other moments where they would kind of get their feathers ruffled a little bit, because they're like, oh no, that's not me. So you kind of I make sure that you do really kind of look at it as just one more blush as to who potentially someone is. And sometimes people may not even see this in themselves. So, but I just find it incredibly fascinating. I know Shannon shares that passion, because it's truly interesting. We live in this country, and yet we've lived different lives.
Well, and I think that there's, even based on the event that I had this morning with another organization, I think that coming out of this, there's so many things. There's I shared before, it was all about like connecting with myself and how do I better use this self-awareness to really ask myself the questions. How do I connect with others? And maybe there's tools that come out of this too that we maybe partner on to say, as we look to build connections across generations, are there maybe onboarding tools or something that we could create and leverage for, different organizations or for people as they're coming together, that we can just have as kind of top of mind indicators that as you're going in to meet a new person, especially that connections over Zoom, it's very difficult to get a read, like a lot of times there's ambiance or background noise, or there's, some sort of like body language indicator. And it's just very difficult to get a read, I think. And, if you don't have the right lighting, or you don't have like the right something, so I really appreciate this as like catalyzing the conversation. I've shared before, I'm just such a data nerd, and like, just like want to consume it all. And so I think that this will be one of many dialogue and conversations that we can continue to have. But anybody that is watching this, during this event or afterwards, please feel free. We'll make sure that we put Lisa and Shannon's information attached to this when we post it. But I do think that for organizations as a whole, having this as a part of your core onboarding and training, it just would be absolutely crucial. As many people, I think, just assume like if you're an employee, you're supposed to just adapt to what the corporate culture is, and that is just not going to work this day and age. So
No, it's not.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it. This was beyond my wildest dreams. You've really just opened my eyes, I think, to even more about how we can really have more empathy between each other, how we can really leverage these insights to support one another, and it has given us food for thought for what are the possibilities that we can do next to kind of dig into this information. So thank you so much again for joining us tonight. And if there's any other questions, please feel free to email us after this, and I'll be sure to send out the link so you can go ahead and share with other members as well.
Thank you, Stevie.
Thank you so much. All right, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, bye.
Bye.